You commute, you pay the mortgage, you save for retirement. You spend 40 years in the corporate desert building a beautiful life for your family. But what happens if you never get to step foot in the paradise you built? Tonight, we explore the Moses tragedy and the terrifying reality of the modern provider. Welcome to The Debate.
Hi, everyone. And for those who might not be familiar, our foundation today rests on this deeply evocative psychological framework. It's drawn directly from the biblical narrative of Moses.
Right. Moses leads his people through a harsh desert for 40 years. He endures endless hardship, rebellion, overwhelming stress, all to bring them to the promised land.
But the kicker is, when they finally arrive, he's denied entry. He's only permitted to view the paradise he built from the top of Mount Nebo before he dies.
Yeah, leaving others to enjoy the fruits of his lifelong labor. And, well, modern psychologists have adapted this into a framework they call the Sacrificial Provider Complex, or the Moses tragedy.
Exactly. It examines the millions of individuals who spend 3 to 4 decades wandering the modern desert. Corporate jobs, chronic stress, financial pressure. They build stability for their families only to be systematically destroyed by the journey itself.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. I take the position that the role of the sacrificial provider is a profoundly noble, beautiful tragedy. Enduring this hardship to build a promised land of financial stability for one's family is, in my view, the ultimate transcendent purpose of a traditional provider.
And I look at this exact same psychological framework, and I see a terrifying trap. This romanticization of the sacrificial provider is deeply destructive. We are looking at a system where people are treated merely as beasts of burden.
Oh, wow. Beasts of burden?
Yes, conditioned to accept their own destruction. They sacrifice their one singular life for a paradise they are explicitly denied entry to, precisely because the systemic grind breaks their minds and bodies.
Well, to truly understand the profundity of the Moses tragedy, we have to look closely at the mechanics of purpose, right? And evolutionary psychology.
Okay, but
Let me just set this up. The 30 to 40 years a provider spends wandering the desert of corporate jobs, enduring that crushing weight of financial pressure, it isn't some grand societal scam.
I think the data says otherwise.
It is a profound, deliberate act of love rooted in our deepest human instincts. When we look at the source material's central metaphor, we're talking about the highest form of human greatness, planting trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit.
But they aren't planting trees. They're
going into that corporate desert every single day, fully aware of the toll it takes. They absorb the stress of performance reviews, market downturns, the relentless demands of a mortgage, specifically so that their family does not have to.
Right, but at what cost?
Building a paid-off house, ensuring children have a secure launch pad into the world, creating a bulwark of financial stability, even at the cost of one's own personal enjoyment, that is the highest calling. The tragedy of dying on Mount Nebo doesn't negate the value of the journey. It elevates it.
Yeah, see, I come at it from a different way. Primarily because we need to define exactly what this complex is clinically, rather than just philosophically.
Okay, let's hear the clinical side.
Psychologists define the sacrificial provider complex by a specific behavioral triad. First, the chronic compartmentalization of personal needs. Second, a hyperfixation on resource accumulation as the sole metric of self-worth. And third, a persistent underlying dread of obsolescence.
Interesting.
What you're describing as a deliberate act of love is actually a masterclass in how society institutionalizes exploitation. We wrap it in the language of nobility. Modern economic structures have effectively conditioned providers into becoming disposable workhorses.
Disposable?
Completely. We aren't talking about planting a symbolic tree. We are talking about human beings being neurologically and physically ground into dust.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I understand your premise here before we go any further. Are you arguing that the modern corporate structure deliberately engineers this burnout as a feature of the system, or is the burnout just a tragic, accidental byproduct of the individual's own misplaced priorities?
Oh, the system absolutely relies on it.
Really?
Yes, and the psychology of the provider is molded to facilitate it. Let's look at the systemic mechanics here. The corporate ecosystem is designed to extract maximum labor during a human being's most vital years. It conflates net worth with moral worth.
But that's just basic economics, isn't it?
No, it's conditioning. It begins early. You are told your value to your family is directly proportional to your economic output. Therefore, the provider internalizes the idea that self-deprivation is a virtue. They systematically starve their own soul, their own hobbies, their own peace of mind, believing they're being noble.
Because they are?
But this isn't nobility. It's a systemic conditioning that convinces an individual their only intrinsic value is utility. Once that utility is exhausted, once they've pulled the cart to the edge of the paradise, they're discarded. Calling it a noble calling is just the psychological anesthetic we administer to keep the beast pulling the cart.
Well, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what the corporate desert actually represents.
I'm listening.
You characterize the rebellion, the stress, the endless hardship of the provider's life as a form of exploitation. But I argue that this very struggle is what gives life its structural meaning.
Meaning through suffering?
The 40 years of financial pressure is a crucible. Yes, the desert is harsh, but meaning is rarely found in comfort. A person navigating a hierarchy, suppressing their own immediate hedonistic desires and dedicating their labor to their family's survival. They are participating in an ancient, vital human mechanism.
Ancient? We're talking about middle management and mortgages here.
But the biological drive is ancient. Provisioning has always been perilous. The mammoth hunter didn't expect to retire to a life of leisure. The meaning was found in the survival of the tribe. The hardship isn't an accidental byproduct of a broken system, and it isn't an engineered trap.
So what is it?
It is the necessary friction of creation. You simply do not build generational security without profound sacrifice.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You're talking about the friction of creation. But the text and modern psychology tell us exactly what the result of this friction is. It hollows people out.
It tests them.
It ruins them. Let's look at the how and why behind the outcomes the source material describes. You argue this journey protects the family. But why do so many of these providers end up with profoundly cold, alienated marriages by the time they reach retirement?
Well, because the stress of the environment takes a toll. It requires intense focus.
It's much deeper than just focus. It is physiological rewiring.
How so?
When a provider spends 40 years surviving corporate cortisol spikes, managing layoffs, inflation, hostile work environments, their brain fundamentally adapts to chronic stress. To survive that environment, the neurology downregulates emotional availability as a defense mechanism.
So you're saying they literally can't connect?
Exactly. They aren't consciously choosing to be distant partners or absent parents. Their nervous system is literally rewired for threat management. The brain cannot be simultaneously optimized for ruthless corporate survival and vulnerable emotional intimacy.
I think that's a bit of an overstatement.
It's just biology. This is why the journey destroys the very things it claims to protect. What exactly is the victory if you spend 40 years paying for a house, but the soul of the family inside that house is starved of connection, because the provider was reduced to an exhausted, emotionally absent ghost?
That's a grim way to look at provision.
If you sacrifice your emotional health to the point of marital alienation, the promised land you've built is a graveyard. You haven't protected your family, you've merely traded your vitality for a brick structure and a retirement account.
But that view assumes that physical presence and emotional leisure are the only currencies of love, which simply isn't true for the vast majority of human history.
They are essential currencies, though.
The provider's sacrifice is a structural necessity. To dismiss the brick structure and the retirement account as a graveyard ignores the very real terror of poverty. Securing a family against the harsh realities of the world requires an immense expenditure of energy.
It is a necessity dictated by an economic system that loves a dead provider.
Come on, society doesn't love a dead provider.
It absolutely does. Let's really look at the sociological reality here. Society effectively treats these people like a booster rocket on a spaceship. You contain all the combustible energy needed to break the family out of the atmosphere of financial insecurity. You provide the thrust.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
But by design, a booster rocket is meant to burn out, detach, and fall away into the cold ocean so the capsule can reach orbit. There is no structural intention for the booster rocket to join the family among the stars.
That is...
The tragedy of Moses is repeated millions of times over in modern suburbs. Society applauds the person who works themselves into an early grave because it means the dependents are cared for without becoming a burden on the state. It's a deeply cynical mechanism that extracts a human's life force, engineers their detachment, and calls it a virtue.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. To call a provider a disposable booster rocket fundamentally misunderstands the internal psychology of the builder.
Does it?
Yes, because the human mind is uniquely capable of temporal abstraction. We can find immense neurochemical and spiritual reward in a future state we will never physically inhabit. Consider a different analogy. The provider is very much like an architect of a great cathedral in the Middle Ages.
How so?
Those architects laid foundations knowing full well that the construction would take 100 years. They knew they would be in the ground long before the final spire was placed or the stained glass was illuminated by the sun.
Right, but...
Do they feel exploited? Were they merely booster rockets meant to fall into the sea? No, they didn't need to live inside the completed cathedral to know that their life's work was magnificent. The victory for the traditional provider is the paid-off house.
But let me just land this.
The victory is the financial stability of the next generation. That stability is the cathedral. Even if they only see it from afar, even if their body fails them just as the mortgage is finally burned, the triumph remains theirs. They've achieved the absolute pinnacle of their biological and sociological mandate. They secured the survival and flourishing of their lineage. That isn't exploitation, that is immortality.
But the architect of a cathedral was creating art. They were engaged in a craft that fed their soul while they were doing it. The text we are examining specifically describes wandering a desert of corporate stress.
It's a metaphor.
But it maps to environments designed to extract, not to nourish. Data entry, middle management, endless logistics. This isn't stonemasonry. And this brings us directly to the climax of the metaphor, the moment on Mount Nebo.
Yes, the culmination of the journey.
Exactly. The individual has reached the end of the 40 years. They are standing on the mountain, looking out at the paradise they built.
And that moment on the mountain, looking out over the promised land their family will inherit, is a moment of transcendent peace. It's the ultimate fulfillment of duty. They can look at the stability they forged and say, it is finished. They are safe. The psychological closure in that moment is profound.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the devastating reality for listeners who are in their 40s and 50s right now? Standing on the foothills of that very mountain?
What do you mean?
Look at the empirical data on occupational health. When these providers finally stand on Mount Nebo, it is rarely a moment of transcendent peace. It is a terrifying realization that their bodies and minds are too broken to actually enjoy what they built.
Well, aging happens to everyone.
We're talking about allostatic load, the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. They look at the retirement they saved for, the home they paid off, and they realize their joints are shot, their cardiovascular system is compromised by decades of elevated blood pressure, and they drop dead from a heart attack right at the finish line.
I mean, certainly, stress plays a role.
They're denied entry not by a divine decree, but by the physiological ruin the journey inflicted upon them. The tragedy is waking up at 65 and realizing you traded the only life you had for a future you are too broken to inhabit. That isn't peace. It is a moment of existential horror.
Well, hedonistic enjoyment at the absolute center of the human experience, rather than duty and legacy.
Enjoying your retirement isn't hedonism.
But recognizing one's own mortality while simultaneously securing the survival and prosperity of one's descendants is not a psychological failure. It is a defining feature of human progress.
But does progress require self-immolation?
It requires accepting reality. Yes, the body breaks down. Yes, the heart may give out just as the final goal is reached. But physical decay is the human condition, regardless of how you live.
Not at this accelerated rate.
The Moses tragedy asks us to accept our mortality and channel our inevitable decline toward a purpose entirely greater than ourselves. To stand on Mount Nebo and realize that your life was consumed in the service of those you love is to recognize that your life had absolute, unshakable meaning.
a meaning defined by their utility to others.
The sacrifice validates the love. It's a harsh reality, yes, but it's precisely the willingness to endure that harshness that separates the noble provider from the self-serving individual. The legacy remains even if the builder must remain behind in the dust of the mountain.
But you cannot separate the builder from the dust. You cannot separate the mind from the physiological cost of that duty. A legacy built on the unnecessary systemic destruction of the builder is inherently flawed.
It's not unnecessary,
If the price of a family's financial stability is the complete physical and emotional annihilation of the person providing it, then the system itself is what needs to be dismantled, not the individual who needs to be lionized for enduring it.
This brings us to the core of what we've unpacked today. My position remains that the Moses tragedy, while undeniably harsh, full of immense stress, and demanding the ultimate physical cost, well, it stands as a beautiful testament to a provider's absolute devotion. To be the architect who builds a cathedral you will never live in, to be the shield that absorbs the friction of the world so your family doesn't have to, is a profound and noble triumph.
And I maintain that the source material outlines a terrifying psychological reality. It reveals a societal mechanism that leverages our deepest protective instincts against us, grinding people into beasts of burden and romanticizing their destruction to keep them pulling the cart.
Pulling the cart for those they love.
But they endure a 40-year desert only to die at the gates of a paradise they were never truly meant to enter. It's a psychological trap that hollows out marriages, ruins physical health, and discards the individual the moment their economic utility is exhausted.
Yet, despite our vastly different interpretations of the meaning behind this journey, there is a profound point of convergence here. I think we both must acknowledge the immense, indisputable, and often fatal physical and emotional toll that the 30 to 40-year corporate journey takes on modern adults.
We do, absolutely. Whether you view it as a noble sacrifice or a systemic exploitation, the empirical reality remains identical. The promised land comes at a devastating, deeply personal cost.
Right.
The health is ruined, the mind is strained, and the lifespan is severely compromised. The desert takes its pound of flesh every single time.
There is so much more depth to explore within this psychological framework and the ancient text it draws from. We leave you tonight not with a definitive answer to this dilemma, but suspended between two profound perspectives.
The text leaves us with a terrifying, lingering warning to consider. Stop walking in the desert for people who won't even notice when you drop dead in the sand. Claim your land now before it's too late.
Or conversely, recognize that stepping into that desert, fully knowing the risks, is the most profound act of devotion a human being can offer. The choice of which reality to embrace is one every provider must eventually make.